Have you ever stopped to wonder why the most transparent thing about your favorite six-pack is the glass it comes in? Here is something the beer industry is praying you never actually think about. Your shampoo tells you more about what is inside the bottle than your beer does. Your bottle of ketchup tells you more. Even a cheap stick of gas station chewing gum has to legally disclose its ingredients. But beer is the only major packaged beverage sold in the United States where the manufacturer has zero legal obligation to print an ingredient list on the label. You are part of a country that spends over $40 billion a year on beer, and yet for the vast majority of that spend, you are flying totally blind. Most of that money goes to the same 6 brands using the same 3 industrial shortcuts while selling you the same vague promise of refreshment. The reality is that you aren't getting what you're paying for. You're getting whatever they could afford to put in the can after the Super Bowl ad budget was settled. Today we are auditing the beer aisle brand by brand and ingredient by ingredient. I am going to show you exactly which 6 massive brands are running a cost-cutting playbook they've spent decades making sure you never read. And because I'm not just here to ruin your weekend, I'll finish by showing you 3 brands that still brew beer the way it's supposed to be made, with 4 ingredients, a real process, and absolutely nothing to hide. I spent 3 weeks pulling ingredient disclosures, legal filings, and brewing process records to find the truth, and the results were even grimmer than I expected. But to understand why your favorite light lager tastes like a rainy day in a basement, we have to talk about how real beer is actually made, because once you see the math, the marketing stops working. To brew a proper lager, you only need 4 things: water, malted barley, hops, and yeast. That is the entire list. Germany actually codified this as law back in 1516 with the Reinheitsgebot, or the beer purity law. It wasn't just about being fancy, it was about protecting the consumer from getting cheated. Malted barley is the backbone of the whole operation. It provides the sugars that ferment into alcohol, the proteins that hold that beautiful foam head, and the actual flavor that makes beer taste like something other than carbonated water. But here is the problem for a corporate accountant. Malted barley costs roughly $1.50 per pound to process. Corn syrup costs about 40 cents. Rice adjuncts cost even less. The math for a multinational brewery is painfully simple. If you replace 30 to 40% of your barley with corn or rice, you slice your raw material costs by 1/3 instantly. The alcohol percentage stays the same because corn and rice ferment just as efficiently as barley. But the flavor, the body, and the natural foam are gone. What you're left with is a thin, pale liquid that technically qualifies as beer under loose U.S. laws, but shares almost nothing with the product that law was originally designed to describe. That is where the second corporate trick comes in to save the day. Macro breweries use a process called high-gravity brewing. They brew the beer at double the target strength, essentially creating a beer concentrate, and then they dilute it with deaerated water right at the packaging line. One brew kettle now produces double the volume. The problem is that this massive dilution destroys whatever tiny bit of foam and body was left after they skimped on the barley. So they add a chemical foam stabilizer called propyline glycol algenate to fake the head of the beer. You crack the can, you see a brief flash of foam, and your brain says, quality. But that foam isn't from malt. It's from a polymer stabilizer that has more in common with your hair gel than a brewery. The reason they get away with this is buried in Title 27 of the Code of Federal Regulations, Part 7. The TTB's regulations don't require full ingredient disclosure for standard malt beverages. They only have to flag specific allergens or weird additives under very narrow circumstances. The breweries know this, and they have lobbied like hell to keep it this way for decades. When the label says brewed with the finest ingredients, they aren't being descriptive, they're being legally vague. The ingredients aren't listed on the can because if they were, you'd realize you're paying premium prices for a corn syrup chemistry project. Stick around because we're about to name names. And the worst offender on this list is a brand you've probably had in your fridge since college. Now that you know the industry's secret playbook, let's talk about the specific brands that are counting on your ignorance to stay profitable. This is the skip list. 6 brands you should probably put back on the shelf if you actually care about what's going into your body. We are starting with the undisputed king of the mountain, or at least the king of the ad budget. Brand number 1 is Bud Light. If you've watched a football game in the last 30 years, you've been bombarded with the idea that Bud Light is the pinnacle of refreshment. But here is what the billion-dollar marketing machine won't tell you. Bud Light is a masterpiece of cost engineering. It is brewed with water, barley malt, rice, and hops. Now, Anheuser-Busch InBev is very careful never to disclose the actual percentage of rice in that grain bill, but they accidentally showed their hand in 2019. In a massive Super Bowl ad campaign, they decided to mock Miller Lite for using corn syrup, and in doing so, they confirmed to the entire country that Bud Light uses rice as its primary adjunct. They thought rice sounded cleaner than corn syrup, but a federal judge eventually had to step in. Miller filed a countersuit, and the judge noted that the ads were intentionally misleading because they implied the corn syrup was still in the final product, when, in reality, both brands are just using cheap sugars to avoid paying for real malt. Anheuser-Busch InBev spent approximately $1.3 billion on U.S. advertising in 2022 alone. Think about that. The rice is cheaper than the billboard it's advertised on. You aren't paying for the finest ingredients. You're paying for the privilege of being told you're drinking them. If you flip a can of Bud Light, you won't find the word rice anywhere on it. It's a ghost ingredient, essential for the profit margin, invisible on the label. Next up is brand 2, Coors Light. The marketing angle here is legendary. It's cold. The mountains on the can turn blue when it's cold. The ads show people trekking through glaciers to find a can. But here's the blunt truth. Cold is not a flavor profile. Cold is a distraction. When you numb your taste buds with near-freezing temperatures, you can't taste the fact that the beer is packed with rice adjuncts and propylene glycol, algenate. That's the chemical foam stabilizer I mentioned earlier. Because Coors Light is brewed using high-gravity dilution, brewing a thick concentrate and then watering it down, the natural proteins that create foam are basically non-existent. They have to add a polymer to fake the head so it looks like a beer when you pour it. And that Rocky Mountain branding? In 2019, a class action lawsuit alleged that Miller Coors misrepresented its primary brewing location. The branding implies every drop comes from a pristine mountain spring, but the reality is that the beer is pumped out of massive industrial facilities all over the country. Cold isn't a quality standard. It's a way to make sure you don't notice the lack of one. Before we hit the next one, if this kind of deep dive into what you're actually consuming is helpful, hit that subscribe button. We do the digging so you can actually know what you're buying. Brand 3 is Miller Lite. Miller Lite's whole "more taste" slogan is one of the great ironies of the modern world. It is brewed with corn syrup, specifically regular corn syrup, not high fructose, though the distinction is mostly academic for your liver. The brand's defense is that the corn syrup is fully fermented out by the time it reaches your glass, meaning the yeast eats the sugar and turns it into alcohol. That is technically true, but it misses the entire point. The reason they use corn syrup instead of malted barley isn't for taste. It's because corn syrup is a cheap industrial sugar source that provides zero body and zero complexity. By using an adjunct grain bill that strips away the malt responsible for actual taste, they've created a product that is the literal opposite of their slogan. They don't prominently label the corn syrup because they know it tests poorly with consumers who still want to believe their beer comes from a farm, not a refinery. Then we have brand 4, Busch Light. If Bud Light is the king, Busch Light is the rural ambassador. The marketing is all hunting trips, open fields, and latte of the mountains vibes. It's built on an image of rugged authenticity, but the brewing process is anything but authentic. Busch Light is brewed to one of the lowest IBU counts of any nationally distributed lager. IBU stands for International Bitterness Units, which is basically a measure of how many hops were actually used. In the case of Busch Light, the answer is hardly any. It is produced via high-gravity dilution and uses massive amounts of corn adjuncts to replace the malt. The ingredient list tells a story of a product designed to maximize volume and minimize cost per unit. You're drinking a wan addition of water and corn that has been engineered to be as inoffensive as possible, so you can drink 12 of them without noticing you aren't enjoying a single one. Brand 5 is Natural Light, or Natty, as it's known on every college campus in America. The name is doing a staggering amount of heavy lifting here. In the United States, the word natural on a beer label has zero regulated legal definition. A brewery can take a high-gravity corn syrup concentrate, dilute it with processed water, hit it with chemical stabilizers, and still call it natural without facing a single regulatory challenge. Natural Light is brewed at high gravity and diluted to roughly 4.2% ABV. It contains corn syrup, rice adjuncts, and those same chemical stabilizers to keep it from looking like the water it mostly is. This isn't a food standard. It's a marketing decision made in a boardroom to capture a specific price point. Finally, Brand 6, Keystone Light. This one is produced by Molson Coors in the same facilities as Coors Light, often sharing the exact same process infrastructure. Its malt-to-adjunct ratio is among the lowest in the entire industry, according to formulation estimates. The always smooth branding is the entire pitch. And in this case, smooth is just a polite way of saying the beer has so few hops and so little residual malt character that there is literally nothing left to taste. It is the logical conclusion of the cost-cutting playbook. Corn adjuncts, high-gravity dilution, and foam stabilizers. At least they are honest about it being smooth because there's no substance left to be rough. If you have any of these in your fridge right now, I want you to run a quick test. It's called the head retention test. It takes 30 seconds and requires nothing but a clean glass. Pour your beer into a room temperature glass at a 45-degree angle. Let the foam settle and then just watch it. A real malt-forward beer, the kind we're going to talk about next, will hold a dense, creamy head for at least 2 to 3 minutes because the barley proteins naturally stabilize the bubbles. Now do it with a Bud Light or a Natty. Watch that head collapse in under 60 seconds. The barley proteins were diluted out at the factory and replaced with a polymer that can't hold up for more than a minute. If your beer can't hold its own head for 2 minutes, the grain bill just told you everything the label refused to. And now, the part where sitting through all that industrial chemistry and corporate gaslighting actually pays off. Because once you know exactly how the game is rigged, you can finally stop playing it. The beer aisle isn't just a graveyard for your standards. There are still people out there who treat brewing like an art form rather than a line item for an accounting firm. I've gone through the records, tracked the ingredient disclosures, and looked at the actual production costs. These are the 3 brands that are actually worth your money, starting with the ultimate value play and moving up to the heavy hitters who have never let a marketing budget touch their kettles. Brand 1, Yuengling Traditional Lager. If you live on the East Coast, you probably know it as the default, but you might not realize how much of a miracle this beer actually is. D.G. Yuengling & Son was founded in 1829 in Pottsville, Pennsylvania. That makes it the oldest operating brewery in the United States. They have survived Prohibition, 2 world wars, and over a century of acquisition attempts from the macro giants we just finished auditing. And here is the kicker, they are still family-owned. That matters because when you aren't answering to a board of directors demanding a 2% increase in quarterly dividends, you don't have to start cutting corners on your barley. Now, Yuengling does use corn, specifically corn grits, and they are completely open about it. But there is a massive difference between what Yuengling does and what the big guys do. For Yuengling, those corn grits are a traditional part of a historical American lager recipe that hasn't changed in generations. They aren't using them as a high fructose shortcut to save a nickel. They're using them for a specific, crisp flavor profile. More importantly, Yuengling refuses to touch high-gravity dilution. They brew their beer to strength, which means they don't have to water it down and then inject it with propylene glycol algenate just to keep the foam from disappearing. When you pour a Yuengling, that head of foam is real. It's made of barley protein and history, not polymers. In most markets, whether you're at a Kroger or a local corner store, a six-pack of Yuengling costs almost exactly the same as a six-pack of Bud Light. You are paying the same price, but in one hand you have a corporate chemistry project, and in the other, you have actual beer. That is the kind of value play the macro category refuses to offer you, and Yuengling has been quietly delivering it for nearly 2 centuries. And now, why sitting through the bad news was worth it, we move to brand 2, Sierra Nevada Pale Ale. If you want to know what happens when a brewery prioritizes the kettle over the billboard, this is the gold standard. In 1980, a guy named Ken Grossman built a brewery in Chico, California, using salvaged dairy equipment and a stubborn commitment to doing things the hard way. He decided on a 100% malted barley grain bill and whole cone Cascade hops. No adjuncts, no corn syrup, no rice, no shortcuts. Over 40 years later, Sierra Nevada Pale Ale is still brewed to that exact same standard, and the label actually tells you what's inside. If you run the head retention test we talked about earlier on a Sierra Nevada, it won't just pass, it'll set the curve. That dense, creamy foam stays in the glass for minutes because it's supported by real barley protein and the natural resins from real hops. The hop character you taste isn't a lab-created hop extract or a chemical flavoring. It's from real Cascade hops added at a real cost. Sierra Nevada is now one of the largest craft breweries in America, which is great for you because it means you can find it almost anywhere, from Whole Foods to a gas station in the middle of nowhere. When you look at the price per ounce, it's often comparable to the premium macro six-packs. The difference is that Ken Grossman never ran a Super Bowl ad. He spent that money on the hops. When you buy this, you are paying for the physical ingredients in the can, not the celebrity cameo in the commercial. Finally, we have brand 3, Dogfish Head 60-Minute IPA. This is for when you're tired of being lied to and you want a beer that actually has some teeth. Founded in 1995 in Milton, Delaware, by Sam Calagione, Dogfish Head built its entire reputation on a single, labor-intensive idea: continuous hopping. Most breweries add hops at the beginning and the end of the boil. Dogfish Head built a machine, originally a modified vibrating football game, to add hops continuously for the entire 60 minutes of the boil. This requires a massive volume of real, whole hops and a brewing process that most corporate accountants would call insanely inefficient. But that inefficiency is exactly why it tastes the way it does. The full grain bill is disclosed. There are 0 adjuncts, 0 dilution, and absolutely no chemical foam agents. It costs more than a macro lager, and it should. Every extra dollar you spend on a 60-minute IPA is a dollar that went into the quality of the malt and the quantity of the hops, not a marketing budget designed to trick you. When you hold this can and feel that it costs a little more than the smooth or cold-filtered options next to it, you aren't paying a premium for branding. You are paying the honest price of a product that wasn't designed to be cheap. It was designed to be good. The contrast here is night and day. On one side of the aisle, you have brands spending billions to hide the fact that they've replaced half their barley with corn syrup. On the other, you have breweries that believe the product in the glass is the only pitch that matters. If you've spent your life drinking the Big Six, the first sip of a real, malt-forward beer might actually shock you. It has body, it has texture, it has a head of foam that doesn't vanish the second you look away. It's the difference between eating a home-cooked meal and a pack of ramen noodles. They'll both fill you up, but only one of them is actually food. We've been trained to expect so little from our beer that cold and smooth started to sound like quality. But now that you know the math, you can see those words for what they are. The sound of a corporation trying to keep you from asking what's actually in the can. We have one more part to go, where I'm going to give you the concrete rules for navigating the beer aisle so you never get cheated again. Now that you have the names, the science, and the proof that your local liquor store is basically a museum of cost-engineered corn water, I don't want you to just walk away feeling cheated. I want you to walk into that store like an auditor. Because the reality is, your money is the only thing these massive corporations actually listen to. Every time you grab a 30-rack of smooth or natural lagers, you are voting for more secrecy, more corn syrup, and more chemical stabilizers. So, let's talk about how to stop being marketing prey. I've put together 6 concrete rules for navigating the beer aisle that you should probably screenshot or memorize before your next grocery run. These are the red flags and green lights that the industry spends billions of dollars trying to hide behind blue mountains and hunting motifs. Rule number 1 is the transparency test. It's the simplest one on the list. If the brewery doesn't tell you what's in the can, they've usually got a reason for staying quiet. Even though the TTB doesn't force it, transparency is a choice. When you're standing in front of the cooler at a Kroger or a Wegmans, pick up the box. If you see a clear list of ingredients, water, malted barley, hops, yeast, you found a brewery that respects you. If you see a paragraph of marketing fluff about tradition and purity, but zero mention of actual grains, you should assume the worst. A brewery that spends more time describing the feeling of their beer than the ingredients in it is a brewery that is hiding a corn-fed bottom line. Rule number 2 is the buzzword filter. In the beer world, cold filtered, triple hops, and always smooth are legal nothings. They have zero regulatory definition in the United States. Cold filtered is just a fancy way of saying they didn't use heat to stabilize the beer because they were worried it would destroy the already fragile, thin flavor profile. Smooth is code for, we use so few hops and so much rice that there is nothing left to offend your palate. And triple hops? That usually means they took a tiny amount of hops and divided it into 3 stages to make it sound like a craft process. But 3 times 0 is still 0. If the main selling point of a beer is a physical sensation like cold or smooth, rather than a flavor description like malty, bready, or citrusy, you are looking at a product designed for volume, not quality. Rule number 3 is the head retention proxy. You don't need a lab to find the truth. You just need a clean glass and 2 minutes of patience. Remember the test we talked about. If the foam collapses like a wet paper bag in under 60 seconds, you are drinking a high-gravity, diluted product that's likely being propped up by propylene glycol algenate. Real malt creates real foam. If your beer can't hold a head, it's because the brewery didn't want to pay for the barley protein required to keep it there. It is the most honest physical indicator of how much real malted barley actually went into the kettle. Rule number 4 is what I call the marketing tax. Next time you're at Walmart or Target, look at the price difference between a 12-pack of Bud Light and a 12-pack of a regional craft lager or something like Yingling. Usually the difference is only $2 or $3. That $2 gap is what you pay to not have a billion-dollar advertising campaign screamed at you during the Super Bowl. When you buy the cheaper macro brand, you aren't saving money on the ingredients. You're just opting out of the quality so the company can afford to pay a celebrity $5 million to hold a can for 30 seconds. Spend the extra $2. That money goes into the malt, the hops, and the people actually brewing the beer, not the agency on Madison Avenue. Rule number 5 is the 100% malt claim. This is your ultimate green light. If a can specifically says 100% malted barley or all malt, they are legally committing to a product that doesn't use rice, corn, or syrup to pad the alcohol content. It is a rare flex in the mass market world because it is expensive to do. When you see those words, you know you're getting the real deal, a product that would actually pass the 1516 purity laws. Rule number 6 is to watch out for the word natural. As we saw with Natty Light, natural on a beer label in the US is a marketing decision, not a food standard. It can mean anything or nothing. Don't let a mountain on a label or a picture of a wheat field fool you into thinking the process was artisanal. The only thing natural about most macro beers is the natural desire of the parent company to increase their profit margin by another 0.5%. Here is the bottom line. The American beer industry has spent the last 50 years perfecting the art of selling you less for more. They have lobbied to keep their ingredient list secret while building empires on the back of cheap industrial sugars and chemical additives. They want you to believe that beer is just a commodity, a background character for a party or a game, something you shouldn't think too hard about. But once you realize that your six-pack is basically a corn syrup chemistry project with a logo on it, that marketing spell starts to break. You deserve to know what you're putting in your body. You deserve a product that was brewed with 4 ingredients and a sense of pride, not a high-gravity concentrate watered down at the finish line. Real beer still exists. You can find it at almost any grocery store in the country if you know which brands to ignore and which labels to actually read. Yingling, Sierra Nevada, Dogfish Head. These are just the starting points. There are thousands of independent breweries across the U.S. that are doing things the right way, listing their ingredients, and refusing to use polymer stabilizers to fake a head of foam. Support them, because when you stop buying the trash, they have to stop making it. We do these audits so you don't have to go into the store blind. If this deep dive changed the way you look at the beer aisle, share it with someone who still thinks cold is a quality standard. Hit that subscribe button and let me know in the comments which brand that actually discloses its ingredients is your go-to. I want to see which transparent breweries are winning. We'll be back next week to audit another section of your pantry that isn't as clean as the label suggests. Thanks for watching, and stop being a mark for the marketing budget. Drink real beer.